Her son told her she'd die alone, like she lived. Lydia Corbin, retired nurse and widow, didn't flinch. Ethan, her only child and once named heir, smirked and poured another drink. By spring, his name would vanish from her will, her deed, and every account he thought he'd inherit. She'd spent decades as his mother. Now she was her own protector. And when he came for what he believed was his, the law itself would shut the door. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The smell of chicken pot pie filled the kitchen, but it didn't drown out the sound of Mara's artificial laugh drifting from the living room. Lydia moved slowly, placing the pie on a trivet at the center of the table, every gesture deliberate. She'd spent the morning polishing the good silverware more for herself than for them, and the faint metallic scent still clung to her fingers. Ethan stepped in from the hallway, his eyes scanning the room like a man appraising a foreclosed property. "Still got that same couch from the '80s, huh?" he said, smirking. "Guess when I get this place, I'll have to fumigate it." Lydia didn't look up from cutting the pie. "Some things last longer than the people who sit on them," she murmured. Colby trailed behind his father, his sneakers squeaking softly on the hardwood. He gave Lydia a quick, shy smile before dropping into his seat. Mara followed, carrying herself like she'd been forced into enemy territory. They ate in short bursts of chewing in silence. The tick of the wall clock seemed louder than conversation. Lydia asked Colby about school, his science project, the books he liked now. He brightened when talking about a model rocket he'd built, but Ethan cut in with a grunt. "He's just going to end up in business like me." "Science projects are cute, but pointless." Lydia's fork hovered in the air. "Pointless? They teach, Mom," Ethan interrupted, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Don't start lecturing, just let the kid be a kid." Her jaw tightened. She'd learned years ago not to rise to every bait he dangled. Instead, she set her fork down, folded her napkin and said, "I've been meeting with my lawyer, updating some things." Mara's hand paused halfway to her mouth. A flicker so slight it could have been mistaken for a muscle twitch crossed her face. "Oh?" Mara asked, casual but strained. "Yes," Lydia replied, making sure everything's settled. "My will, the house, accounts." Ethan chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Well, that's smart. Better get it squared away so I don't have to dig through your dusty files when the time comes." She didn't respond. Instead, she rose and retrieved a worn leather photo album from the sideboard, placing it in front of Colby. "These are from when your dad was your age," she said softly. Colby leaned in, running his fingers over the plastic sleeves. "Dad, you had a dog." "Yeah," Ethan said, "and you won't have one either." Then with a glance at Lydia, "Don't guilt-trip him into remembering you. He doesn't need your nostalgia." Lydia looked at him, really looked. His mouth was the same shape as when he was 5, and refused to say sorry after breaking her window. But his eyes, they were colder now. "I don't need to be remembered," she said quietly, "just not erased." The meal ended without dessert. Mara gathered their coats while Ethan lingered, scanning the corners of the room as if inventorying her life. At the door, Lydia bent to hug Colby. He let her briefly, before slipping away toward the car. Ethan stayed a moment longer, his breath fogging in the crisp Ohio air. "You'll die alone like you lived," he muttered, not looking at her. The words landed with the weight of a slap, no raised hand, just the sting of something sharp and deliberate. She didn't flinch. She'd learned long ago not to give him that satisfaction. She closed the door. The latch clicked with finality. For a moment, she stood in the stillness, hearing only the soft hum of the refrigerator and the muffled sound of the car pulling away. Then Lydia crossed the room, picked up the phone, and dialed a number she knew by heart. "Ronnie," she said, her voice steady. "I'm ready to rewrite everything." The courthouse smelled faintly of dust and lemon polish, the kind of scent that seeped into its wooden benches over decades. Lydia sat across from Ronnie Dale, who had traded the courtroom for a small office in what used to be a general store. The wide plank floors creaked under every step, the original tin ceiling hovering overhead like an old witness to too many small-town disputes. Ronnie flipped through a manila folder, her reading glasses balanced low on her nose. "Your old will," she said, tapping the first page, "gives Ethan 90% of everything. Colby gets 10. The numbers sat there in black and white, smug and final. Lydia didn't reach for the papers. She just said, "He stopped earning anything from me years ago. I'm done subsidizing his resentment." Ronnie's eyes flickered up, measuring her. "So we're not talking about minor edits. We're talking scorched earth. We're talking accuracy." Lydia replied. Without another word, Ronnie pulled a fresh stack of forms from her desk drawer. The scratch of her pen was deliberate, methodical. "We'll start from scratch," she said. "When this is done, nothing from the old will survives, not even the punctuation." Lydia leaned back, the leather chair sighing under her. Her gaze drifted to the shelves behind Ronnie, lined with case binders, old law books, and a single jar of lemon drops. She thought of the way Ethan had smirked in her kitchen yesterday, already spending a future that wasn't his. An hour later, they walked together to the local bank, the wind sharp against Lydia's cheeks. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed softly as the vault door swung open with a deep, metallic groan. Her safety deposit box was heavier than she remembered. She slid it onto the counter in the small viewing room and lifted the lid. Inside lay the official bones of her life: marriage certificates, property deeds, old stock certificates, and 3 leather-bound journals with the spines worn thin. She rested her hand on them for a long moment before stacking them neatly into her bag. "These go back to the lawyer's office," she said to the banker, who nodded without asking why. By late afternoon, Lydia was back at her kitchen table, the gray sky pressing against the windows. Her phone buzzed. Mara's name lit up the screen. "Ethan said not to guilt you. Just do what's fair." Lydia stared at the text until the letters blurred. Her fingers moved slowly, each keystroke deliberate. Fair isn't always inherited. She didn't wait for a reply. She set the phone down face first, the sound of rain beginning to tap against the glass. When she returned to Ronnie's office the next morning, the new draft was already taking shape. No Ethan, no Mara, no space left for interpretation. There was a sealed addendum Ronnie had folded into a separate envelope, its contents meant for one person, and one person only. Ronnie slid the papers across the desk, her expression unreadable. "You understand what this means?" Lydia picked up the document. The absence of her son's name was louder than any accusation she could have spoken. It was clean, final. "Yes," she said. "It means my story ends the way I decide." Ronnie leaned back, folding her arms. "Then we're done here, for now." The rain outside had turned to a steady hiss, the kind that softened everything it touched. Lydia slipped the papers into her bag, feeling their weight. It wasn't guilt. It was relief. She stood, smoothed her coat, and glanced once more at the envelope containing the sealed addendum. One day it would be opened, but not by Ethan. Not ever. Ronnie's voice broke the quiet. This is going to change everything." "That's the point," Lydia said. Ronnie pushed the final sheet toward her, a faint smile tugging at her mouth. Lydia looked down, and saw it. Ethan's name, gone as if it had never existed. The house was quiet, except for the soft rip of masking tape and the squeak of a marker. Lydia stood in the middle of her living room, roll of colored stickers in one hand, pen in the other. Outside, the February wind pressed against the siding, making the old place creak like it was listening. She started with the mantel clock. Mahogany brass pendulum, the faint scent of lemon oil clinging to it from years of her polishing. A blue dot went on its underside. Donation. No Corbin would argue over it in some bitter estate fight. The dining room came next. She ran her hand along the edge of the walnut table, remembering the Thanksgiving dinners, the spilled gravy, the arguments Ethan used to start when he was bored. She pressed a green sticker onto the underside, going to her cousin Margaret in Akron. Margaret, who had sent cards every Christmas, even after they'd stopped seeing each other. Yellow was for Colby. Those were the hardest ones. The rocking chair by the upstairs window, where she'd once sat with a fussy newborn Ethan, now marked for a boy who'd been taught to keep his love quiet. She stuck the yellow dot under the seat and moved on before she could think too much. By noon, the living room looked like an auction house inventory, splashes of blue, green, and yellow breaking up the familiar shapes. She loaded the first box into her car herself, the cold air stinging her cheeks. The drive to the donation center took 10 minutes, but each mile felt like pulling teeth, ripping pieces of her life out and handing them over. Inside, Joanna Knox looked up from behind the counter, her knit hat still on, as if she never quite warmed up in the drafty building. "You're early, Lydia. That a good sign or a bad one?" "Depends who you ask," Lydia said, sliding the box across the counter. The scent of cardboard and old cedar drifted out as Joanna opened the flaps. The first layer held porcelain teacups, ivory with gold trim. Joanna's brows lifted. "These are beautiful. You sure?" "Family china," Lydia said, her voice flat. "Historically important. The museum can display them. Less chance they end up in a pawn shop." Joanna didn't press. She just started carefully wrapping each piece in tissue paper, her hands moving with the quiet respect of someone who understood this wasn't just stuff. Trip after trip, Lydia unloaded boxes. Old quilts, framed black and white photographs, a carved wooden jewelry box that still smelled faintly of lavender sachets. The sound of tape tearing, boxes thumping onto the counter, and the soft shuffle of Joanna's steps became a strange rhythm, almost soothing. Back home, the house felt thinner. The walls seemed to breathe easier without the weight of decades pressing against them. Lydia sat at her desk, pulling out a sheet of cream stationery. Her handwriting was slow but steady. "Colby, you weren't the problem. No more, no less." She slid the note into an envelope, sealed it, and wrote "Open on your 18th birthday" across the front. The yellow dot went on the corner before she tucked it into the small cedar chest already marked for him. That evening she met Ronnie at her office. The update was simple but surgical. Colby's portion of the estate would be moved into a locked education trust. No parental access, no early withdrawals, no loopholes. "If Ethan tries to touch this," Ronnie said, tapping the page, "it'll be like trying to pick a lock that isn't there." Lydia signed without hesitation. The pen's tip scratched the paper, a sound she found more satisfying than she expected. As she drove home, the sky was a dull steel gray, the kind that made headlights look like tiny suns. She pulled into her driveway to find the answering machine blinking in the window. She pressed play. Mara's voice came through, syrupy sweet, almost playful. "So when do we tour your house again? Just for fun?" The doorbell rang in the kind of way that wasn't a question, it was a demand. 3 sharp bursts, followed by the faint shuffle of shoes on the porch. Lydia froze in the hallway, her hand hovering over the knob, before pulling it back. Through the frosted glass, she saw Ethan's outline, shoulders squared, Mara just behind him in a fitted wool coat, her smile visible even in silhouette. They looked like a couple about to view an open house, eager, anticipatory. She unlatched the door but kept the screen shut. "You're here without calling," she said, her voice steady. "Just thought we'd drop by," Ethan said, peering past her shoulder like he could see into the living room. "Thought maybe we could do a walkthrough. You know, help you figure out what needs updating before you transition things." Lydia kept her hand on the frame. "I'm not a property preview, Ethan. This isn't a listing." Mara stepped forward, her tone all honey. "We just want to help you prepare. You've got a lot of stuff. We don't want you to feel overwhelmed." "No need," Lydia said. "I already cleaned house." Ethan's brow creased. "What do you mean cleaned house?" She didn't answer. Instead, she let the silence hang, then turned slightly so they could see past her. The hallway walls, once lined with decades of framed photos, were bare. The shelves that used to hold porcelain figurines and photo albums stood empty. The air inside felt different now, less like a home, more like a vault with nothing left to steal. Mara's smile faltered, the edges stiffening. Ethan tried to peer deeper, shifting his stance like he might push the door open. Lydia stepped closer to the screen. I'm busy, she said. And you're done here. Something in her tone must have landed, because they didn't push it further. Ethan muttered something under his breath, too low for her to catch, and they turned away. She waited until they were halfway down the walkway before closing the door, the latch clicking like punctuation. The sound of their car door slamming carried faintly through the cold air, followed by the low hum of an engine retreating down the street. That evening the knock was gentler. 3 slow raps and a pause. When she opened the door this time, Pastor Kellen stood there, bundled in his long coat, scarf tucked neatly under his chin. Snowflakes clung to his hair. Thought I'd check in, he said. Saw some visitors earlier. Didn't look like they stayed long. They didn't, Lydia said, moving aside so he could step in. He walked into the living room and stopped, taking in the bare walls, the stripped shelves. You've been busy. It was time, she said. He turned to her, eyes kind but intent. Protecting your memory, he said slowly, is holy work. Sometimes holier than forgiving. She didn't respond, but something in her chest loosened a little. He stayed for tea, both of them speaking only when necessary, the kind of silence that didn't demand filling. After he left, the house felt calmer. She sat at her desk, scrolling through her email, when a new message popped up from Ronnie. They've started sniffing. Want to trigger the trust early? Her finger hovered over the trackpad, the cursor blinking in the reply box. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches, the sound like knuckles against glass. The email from Ronnie still glowed on Lydia's laptop screen, the cursor blinking like it was waiting for her to change her mind. They've started sniffing. Want to trigger the trust early? She didn't hesitate. Her reply was 2 words. Do it. The next morning, the sky was a low lid of slate gray, as Lydia walked up the narrow steps to Ronnie's office. The cold bit through her coat, each gust of wind slipping under the collar like fingers testing for weakness. Inside, the warmth smelled faintly of coffee and paper, comforting but edged with the scent of legal work about to be done. Ronnie had already spread the documents across her desk, each page anchored by a brass paperweight shaped like a gavel. We'll start with the house, she said, sliding the top form toward Lydia. The agreement was simple. Her cousin Margaret would hold the title, effective immediately. In return, Lydia kept full residency for the rest of her life. No rent, no restrictions, no one to question what she did with it. Margaret had already signed, her neat handwriting looping calmly across the bottom line. She's fine with this? Lydia asked. Ronnie nodded. She said she'd rather see you live without worry than watch vultures circle. Lydia took the pen. The ink glided smoothly, the kind of finality that didn't leave room for erasure. From there they moved to Colby's trust. Ronnie's tone grew sharper, almost protective. Locked until he's 18. No early withdrawals, no loans, no parental claims. If they try to contest, the trust pays for the defense, not them. A small smile touched Lydia's lips. That's good. He'll have his future, even if they try to take it. By the time the paperwork was done, the afternoon light had turned the windows to pale gold. But Lydia wasn't finished. She reached into her bag and pulled out 2 bond certificates, each one older than Ethan's marriage. I'm cashing these in, she said. The girls' shelter on Maple Street could use the help. Ronnie glanced up. That'll make waves. That's the idea, Lydia replied. The transaction took an hour at the bank, the teller's polite professionalism, barely hiding her curiosity at the donation form. By the time Lydia walked back to her car, her breath was visible in short, white bursts, but her chest felt lighter. That evening, as she was slicing vegetables for dinner, the phone rang. She recognized the number before she picked up. Ethan says you're acting paranoid. Mara's voice came through, falsely bright. Are you okay? Or just old? Lydia set down the knife, wiped her hands on a towel, and let the silence stretch. Old enough, she said finally, to know what regret looks like, and how to prevent it. There was a pause, just long enough for Lydia to hear Mara's sharp inhale, then a clipped, "Well, I guess we'll talk later," and the line went dead. She finished making her soup in quiet, the kitchen filled with the soft simmer of broth and the faint scent of thyme. The phone didn't ring again. 2 days later, Ronnie called. Lydia was sitting by the window, watching the neighbor's kids drag a sled across the icy sidewalk. "It's done," Ronnie said, her voice carrying the kind of satisfaction lawyers usually keep hidden. "House title transferred, trust funded and locked, donations cleared, all assets retitled. Ethan legally owns nothing. Not now, not later." Lydia looked out at the kids, their laughter breaking through the brittle winter air. She felt no triumph, just a clean stillness, as if she'd finally swept out a room she'd avoided for years. "Good," she said. "Let's keep it that way." The cold bit sharper than usual that morning, the kind that made the air taste metallic. Lydia locked her front door with a deliberate turn of the key, and didn't look back. On the curb Thomas leaned against his sedan, a gloved hand resting on his messenger bag. "Morning," he said, opening the passenger door for her. "You ready for this?" "I've been ready since yesterday," she replied, sliding in. The bank rose at the corner like an old century, red brick tall clock, windows fogged from the heat inside. Stepping through the glass doors was like entering a different season. Warmth hit her face, and the mingled smells of coffee, paper, and carpet cleaner settled around her. The branch manager, Sylvia Vance, had a precision haircut and the kind of steady demeanor that came from decades of weathering other people's emergencies. She shook their hands before leading them into her office. A small glass box with a view of the lobby's aquarium. "I've reviewed your instructions," Sylvia said, sliding a folder across the desk. "Some of these changes require your initials and signature in person." She began with the first, removing Ethan as an emergency contact and verbal authorizer. "He doesn't have transaction authority," she explained, "but with the right security answers he could still see your balances." "Then he's no longer my emergency," Lydia said flatly. Sylvia nodded. "Initial here, and here." The pen's scratch was deliberate. Thomas watched over her shoulder, nodding as Sylvia typed briskly, each keystroke a quiet erasure. "That severs all visibility," Thomas confirmed. "If he calls, the system will show no record." "Good," Lydia said. Next came the dormant savings accounts, 2 of them quietly accruing dust. "Your son is listed as backup beneficiary," Sylvia noted. Lydia didn't touch the forms immediately. Those accounts had been opened for milestones, one when Ethan was 12, the other when Colby was born. She'd imagined teaching them how interest grew, the way patience could make numbers multiply. That hope had long gone stale. "Close them," she said finally. "Where should the balances go?" Sylvia asked. "To my grandson's trust," Lydia said, sliding a slip of paper from her bag. It held Ronnie's routing and account detail. Sylvia typed quickly, then turned the monitor so Lydia could see the confirmation. "Funds transferred. He can't access a cent. It's either protected or gone." Lydia felt something loosen in her shoulders. "And I want a monthly deposit to the trust," she added. "Small, automatic." On the first. Sylvia wrote the figure on a sticky note, just enough to matter, never enough to tempt. "Done," she said. "Statements will go directly to the trust. Parents won't have access. Any attempt triggers a compliance flag." Lydia's eyes shifted to the glass wall. In the lobby, a boy about Colby's size stood with his nose nearly pressed to the aquarium, watching a single orange fish glide lazy loops. He laughed, the sound soft but clear enough to cut through the stale hum of the bank. They signed the final form, and Sylvia gathered the papers with a firm nod. "Mrs. Corbin, you've built an airtight wall." "Not a wall," Lydia corrected. "A locked door. And I know who gets the key." Outside, the air hit sharper than before. Thomas paused at the curb. "You know this stops the access," he said quietly, "but not the noise." "I can live with noise," she said. "I've lived with worse." Home was still and cold when she returned, like the rooms had been holding their breath. She bent to pick up the mail, coupon flyers, a church bulletin from across the street, and a folded sheet of notebook paper. No envelope. She opened it slowly. "If you're being manipulated, tell us." No signature. The handwriting was neat, impersonal. Lydia stood in the hallway, the note dangling from her fingers. Then she carried it into the living room, opened the fireplace screen, and laid it on the embers. The paper curled in on itself before catching fire, black veins racing to the edges. The smell was sharp, like burned sugar. The phone vibrated on the mantel. Ronnie's name lit the screen. Lydia answered. Ethan just tried to take out a loan. Ronnie said, her voice clipped. Using your name. Lydia watched the last scrap of ash collapse into the grate. Then it's time, she said. He learned what zero really means. The sound of Ronnie's voice still echoed in Lydia's ear from the night before. He tried to take out a loan, using your name. Sleep had been shallow and fractured, her mind circling the same question: how many times had he already used her name without her knowing? By 8:15 a.m., she was seated at Ronnie's desk, coffee cooling untouched beside her, the winter sun cutting through the blinds in narrow gold stripes. Ronnie's laptop screen glowed with a list of the 3 major credit bureaus. We file with all of them, Ronnie said. One report isn't enough. The words fraud alert looked almost clinical in black font, but the weight behind them was anything but. Lydia signed the first form, the tip of her pen biting into the paper harder than necessary. Ronnie dialed, gave her professional ID, and began the sequence. Equifax, Experian, TransUnion, her voice steady, authoritative. When it was Lydia's turn to confirm details, she spoke her name slowly, as though reclaiming each syllable from Ethan's grasp. I am the only person authorized to open accounts in my name, she said into the receiver. Next came the police station, its brick facade dusted with frost, the flag outside snapping in the wind. The lobby smelled faintly of old coffee and printer toner. A young officer at the desk looked up, took their names, and buzzed them through to a back office. Detective Alvarez was middle-aged, the kind of man who looked like he'd been through enough small-town scandals to know where the real damage hid. He listened without interruption, as Ronnie laid out the timeline. Then he turned to Lydia. You understand, he said. Family fraud is still fraud. I do, Lydia said. Her voice didn't waver. The affidavit took 20 minutes, her neat signature anchoring each page like a nail in a coffin lid. When Alvarez slid the final copy into a folder, he met her eyes. If he tries again, the system will flag it instantly. You'll get a call. He won't get a cent. Back in Ronnie's office, they went further. Credit lock, account monitoring for 5 years, identity alerts tied to her social security number. Ronnie explained each measure, but Lydia hardly needed the details. She could already feel the invisible wall building brick by brick. By the time she stepped back into the cold, the afternoon light was thin and brittle. Her gloves smelled faintly of the cedar drawer she kept them in. She walked home, the crunch of salt under her boots loud in the stillness. Just before sunset, there was a soft knock at the door. Pastor Kellen stood there, his scarf tucked neatly into his coat, holding a lidded container. Chicken noodle, he said simply. Made extra. He stepped inside only far enough to place it on the entryway table. No lecture, no probing questions, just a quiet, steady presence. Before leaving, he gave a small nod that felt more like a blessing than a farewell. The soup stayed warm on the stove until evening, filling the house with the scent of thyme and slow-cooked broth. Lydia ate in silence, spoon scraping gently against the ceramic bowl. Her phone buzzed mid-bite. Mara's name lit the screen, followed by a message. We didn't know it would flag you. Ethan says it was just paperwork confusion. Lydia read it twice, then set the phone down without replying. Some lies were too lazy to deserve a response. The next morning, frost webbed across the porch rail, glittering in the pale light. Lydia was halfway through pouring her first cup of coffee when a sharp, insistent knock rattled the front door. She opened it. Ethan stood on the porch, face red from the cold and something hotter. His jaw worked like he was chewing on words too big to swallow. Mom, he said, voice tight, we need to talk. Lydia didn't move from the doorway. The steam from her coffee curled between them like a thin, fragile wall. The cold air followed Ethan into her doorway, like a second intruder. He didn't wait for an invitation. One hand was jammed into the pocket of his coat, the other gesturing in sharp arcs, as if he could cut the distance between them with movement alone. "You've been poisoning people against me," he snapped. "My wife, my son. The whole damn family thinks I'm some kind of criminal because of you." Lydia's fingers tightened around the edge of the door, but her voice stayed even. "You said I'd die alone," she reminded him, each word measured. "Why come now?" His laugh was short, bitter. "Because I deserve clarity. I want to know exactly what's in your will. Mara and I are tired of hearing rumors." "You don't want clarity," she said, leaning just slightly into the screen door. "You want confirmation of something that doesn't belong to you." He stepped closer, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "You can't just erase me, Mom. This house, this history is mine. It's ours." Her hand moved to the brass latch, not to open it, but to make her boundary visible. She tilted her chin toward the street, voice calm as glass. "This isn't yours. Not now. Not later. Not ever." A muscle jumped in his jaw. "You've lost it," he muttered, shaking his head. "You're letting people, lawyers, nosy neighbors, tell you what to do with your life." Lydia didn't argue. Arguments were an invitation. Instead, she reached to the small black button mounted beside the doorframe and pressed it. A quiet chime sounded from inside the house, the porch camera activating with a small click. Ethan's eyes flicked toward it. "You calling someone?" "I'm letting someone watch," she said. They stood in the cold silence that followed, the winter wind tugging at the hem of her sweater. Down the block, a delivery truck idled, its diesel hum mixing with the occasional crow call. He tried again, voice low and sharp. "You think locking me out makes you safe? It makes you cruel." She didn't blink. 30 minutes later, the blue and white sheriff's cruiser rolled up, tires crunching over a patch of salt and snow. Deputy Harris stepped out, his breath forming small clouds in the air. He spoke to Ethan first, voice neutral, posture unhurried. After 2 minutes, Ethan's shoulders slumped, his hands rising in a gesture that was part frustration, part defeat. Harris walked over to Lydia, who had opened the door just enough for conversation. "You want me to file this as a formal trespass warning?" "Yes," she said. "And I want a copy for my records." Harris nodded, scribbling in his notepad before returning to Ethan. There was a muted exchange, then Ethan turned toward the street. "You'll regret this when you're sick and dying," he called back over his shoulder, voice cracking in the cold. Lydia didn't flinch. She closed the door, engaged the deadbolt, and walked to the living room window. Through the lace curtain, she watched him climb into his car, slam the door and roar away. The sound of his engine faded into the muted winter air, leaving only the ticking of the wall clock and the distant rumble of the delivery truck. That night, she sat at her kitchen table, the warmth from the radiator barely reaching her toes. She thought of his words, not the threat, but the assumption that sickness would make her desperate enough to call him. That dependency would somehow undo everything she'd built. The next morning, she woke early, the sky still the dark blue of pre-dawn. She poured her coffee, steam curling in front of her face, and reached for the phone. "Dr. Mendel's office," a voice answered. "This is Lydia Corbin," she said. "I need to book a full physical. And while I'm there, I'd like to update my advance directive." The sterile tang of antiseptic lingered in the air as Lydia sat in the exam room, legs crossed neatly at the ankle, her coat folded across her lap. The hum of the fluorescent light above seemed louder in the quiet. "Dr. Mendel walked in holding a slim folder, her expression unreadable until she settled into the chair across from Lydia. "Well," Mendel said, flipping the folder open, "I hope you're ready for good news." Lydia arched a brow. "Blood work is excellent. Cholesterol, blood sugar, better than most people in their 50s. Cognition testing, perfect score. Physical mobility," she smiled. "You're strong, Lydia. Very strong." Lydia felt a slow warmth spread through her chest. Not joy, exactly, but confirmation. The one weapon Ethan was waiting to use on her had been yanked from his hands. "Good," she said simply. Mendel tilted her head. "You seem almost relieved." "I'm exactly as relieved as I need to be." When she left the clinic, The cold morning air bit at her cheeks, but it felt lighter somehow. She didn't go straight home. Instead, she walked 2 blocks to Ronnie's office. The bell above the old general store door chimed, as she stepped in, shaking off her gloves. "I want my living will updated," she told Ronnie before even sitting down. Ronnie didn't flinch. "What's the change?" "If I'm hospitalized under any circumstances, Ethan and Mara are to have no contact. Not by phone, not in person, not through anyone else. They're locked out." Ronnie nodded, already pulling the correct form. "An emergency contact. Colby," Lydia said, her voice softening briefly. "But under your guardianship. If he's a minor, everything goes through you." Ronnie's pen scratched across the paper. "That'll hold." From there, Lydia moved with surgical precision. She left Ronnie's with 3 certified copies of the updated documents and made her next stop at Dr. Mendel's office. Mendel's receptionist looked surprised when Lydia handed her an envelope marked Advanced Directive. "Corbin, please add this to my file," Lydia said. "It's current and final." The receptionist nodded, sliding the envelope into a locked drawer. Her last stop was the local hospital's administration office, a beige-carpeted space that smelled faintly of coffee and copier toner. She handed another envelope to the records clerk, who stamped it with a date and time before placing it into an internal bin. By the time she stepped outside, the late afternoon light had begun to turn gold at the edges. The wind was still sharp, but the certainty in her steps warmed her from within. That evening, Lydia decided she would end the day on her terms. She put on her navy wool coat, brushed her hair back, and walked to the small French bistro 3 blocks away. The place smelled of garlic butter and wine. Candles flickered in low holders on every table. The hostess glanced at her reservation card. "Table for 1. "Yes," Lydia said, and smiled. She ordered a ribeye medium rare, with a glass of red that glowed like garnet in the candlelight. Between bites, she let the quiet settle over her like a well-made quilt. She didn't scroll her phone. She didn't pretend to be busy. When the wine glass was nearly empty, she raised it slightly toward the empty chair across from her. "To being alone," she said under her breath. "And whole." The clink of crystal was her only reply. Back home, she hung her coat on its peg and loosened her scarf. The house was warm, faintly scented with the rosemary from the plant she kept on the kitchen sill. She was halfway through unbuttoning her cuffs when a knock rattled the front door. Through the peephole, she saw her neighbor, Diane, bundled in a puffer coat, her mouth set in a careful line. Lydia opened the door. "I thought you should know," Diane said quietly. "Mara's been going around the neighborhood, crying, telling people you're losing your mind." The cold air from the open doorway brushed over Lydia's skin, but the heat rising under it was something else entirely. She leaned against the frame, her voice calm. "Then I suppose it's time the truth made the rounds too." Diane hadn't been the only one Mara had reached. By the time Saturday rolled in, Lydia had counted 3 separate check-in calls from neighbors, each with the same cautious tone, as if they were approaching a wounded animal that might bite. So when the doorbell rang that afternoon, and she found Gary and Lenore Kavanagh on her porch, hands clasped, eyes loaded with quiet concern, she didn't let them linger outside. "Come in," she said. "You might as well see for yourselves." The air inside her living room carried the faint scent of lemon polish from the morning's cleaning. She gestured toward the sofa and went to the sideboard, retrieving a tidy stack of folders. "You've heard things," she said, setting the papers down. "I'd prefer you hear the truth." Gary shifted in his seat. "Mara's been, well, she's worried about you, says you're pushing everyone away, that you've made changes you'll regret." Lydia opened the first folder, her old will. She turned it toward them so they could read the neatly typed clauses. Ethan Corbin, 90% of estate. Colby Corbin, 10%. Then she laid the second folder beside it. The ink on the new will still dark and sharp. Ethan's name was absent. Colby's portion sat in a trust. "That's not rumor," she said. "That's choice." Lenore frowned slightly. "Mara said the will was unchanged, that you'd been tricked into signing something without knowing." Without a word, Lydia flipped to the next document. The police report, stamped and dated, detailing Ethan's attempt to use her name for a loan. Beside it, the affidavit from Detective Alvarez. She didn't speak over their reading, letting the quiet stretch until it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. When Gary looked up, his face had lost its polite concern. "We thought you were just being cold," he said slowly. "But you've been careful," Lydia finished for him. Lenore leaned back, the change in her posture almost imperceptible but telling. "I suppose it's easier to listen to the person crying in your driveway than the one quietly building a case." Lydia smiled faintly. Mara's always been skilled at performance. The conversation ended with Gary clearing his throat and promising they'd pass along what they'd seen. Lydia didn't ask them to. She knew the neighborhood's social currents well enough. Whispered stories moved faster than garbage pickup. That evening she called Ronnie. "Prepare a cease and desist," she said. "Slander, defamation, use whatever applies. If Mara keeps planting stories, I want it in writing that she's been warned. I'll have it ready by Monday." Ronnie replied, her voice clipped but approving. Sunday morning brought a different sort of reckoning. Lydia wasn't in the habit of attending services every week, but she walked into the small church anyway, the faint scent of incense clinging to the old wooden pews. Pastor Kellen's sermon was quiet, deliberate. "Truth," he said, from the pulpit, "often wears old shoes. It doesn't arrive with a trumpet or fanfare. It walks in steady and sure, carrying its own proof. The wise know how to recognize it, no matter how many louder voices try to drown it out." No names were spoken, but Lydia caught Diane glancing her way, and behind her Gary giving a small nod. By the following Thursday the shift was visible. Mara's car no longer lingered in driveways. The women who once invited her for coffee now offered only stiff smiles from a distance. Invitations stopped. Side eyes started. The neighborhood's temperature had changed. Lydia didn't celebrate. She simply took note. That evening she sat at her desk, sorting through a small pile of mail, when her laptop pinged with a new email. The subject line was short and clinical: "Petition for power of attorney." Her eyes scanned the sender, County Probate Court, and then the attached PDF. Petitioners: Ethan Corbin and Mara Corbin. Grounds: diminished capacity. Lydia leaned back in her chair, the corners of her mouth curving, not in surprise, but in the recognition of a move she'd already anticipated. The game had changed shape, but not direction. She reached for her phone. "Ronnie," she said, when the line picked up, "it's time to schedule a court date." The courthouse loomed ahead, its sandstone facade stained by decades of Ohio winters. Lydia climbed the steps slowly but not out of necessity. Each stride was measured, deliberate. Her charcoal coat brushed against her knees, navy gloves tucked neatly over her hands. The morning air smelled faintly of exhaust and damp stone. Inside, the hallways echoed with the shuffle of shoes and the murmurs of attorneys conferring with clients. Ronnie was already waiting outside the probate courtroom, a leather briefcase at her feet and a stack of files balanced in her arms. "You're early," Ronnie said, eyeing her client's perfectly pressed coat. "I'm prepared," Lydia replied. When the bailiff called the case, they stepped inside. The courtroom was warmer than the hallway, but carried the faint, musty smell of old paper. Lydia took her seat at the respondent's table, spine straight, eyes forward. Across the aisle, Ethan and Mara sat close together, Mara's hand on his arm like she was steadying him, though her eyes darted nervously toward the gallery. Judge Danforth, a man whose silver hair matched the steel of his gaze, reviewed the docket. "Petition for power of attorney, based on alleged diminished capacity," he read aloud. "Petitioners, you may proceed." Ethan rose, adjusting his tie like the movement could buy him confidence. "Your Honor," he began, "my mother has been making erratic decisions. She's liquidating assets, changing legal documents." Ronnie stood. "Objection, Your Honor. We will address each allegation with documented evidence." Danforth nodded for Ethan to continue, but the cracks were already showing. When it was Ronnie's turn, she moved with precision. One by one, she laid the documents on the evidence table. Lydia's recent medical clearance, signed by Dr. Mendel, the notarized living will, the trust documentation, signed bank logs, and the police report from the identity theft attempt. Each page was a nail in the coffin of Ethan's petition. Medical clearance, Ronnie said, tapping the first page. Full cognitive and physical competency. Legal documents executed without coercion. Financial accounts monitored and secured. Petitioners have no standing other than personal dissatisfaction with the respondents' choices. When Ethan was called to the stand, he tried to salvage ground. "She's out of it sometimes," he said. Ronnie's eyebrow arched. "Out of it, yes, confused. But other times she's coordinated, even spiteful. So, in your own words, she's both incapable and capable of strategic decision-making." Ethan hesitated. "Yes, I mean you can't have it both ways, Mr. Corbin," Ronnie said, her tone flat. The judge scribbled a note, then looked up. "Mr. Corbin, your testimony is contradictory. Combined with the evidence before me, I find no basis for granting this petition. In fact," he leaned forward slightly, "I note the possibility of financial motivation." Mara's lips parted in a sharp breath, her eyes glistening. Ethan's jaw tightened. Lydia stood only when the judge dismissed the case. Her voice carried in the quiet courtroom. "My son asked if I'd die alone," she said, her gaze fixed on Ethan. He made sure of it. Ethan's glare could have cracked glass. Mara dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Outside, the air felt cleaner, the winter sunlight sharp against the courthouse steps. Lydia was halfway to the sidewalk when she heard quick footsteps behind her. "Grandma!" She turned just in time for Colby to barrel into her, his small arms locking around her waist. He hugged her hard, his cheek pressed against her coat. "I can't stay," he whispered. "Dad's mad. But I'm not." Before she could speak, Mara's voice called from across the plaza. Colby pulled back, eyes darting toward his parents, then gave her one last squeeze before running back. Lydia stood still, the imprint of his arms lingering as the wind picked up, tugging at her coat like it wanted her to move, but she didn't. Colby's arms had been around her only a second before the courthouse doors closed behind her, but the ghost of that touch clung all the way home. She had not planned on seeing him that day, not without the filtered presence of Ethan or Mara, but there he'd been, running toward her in the cold cheeks pink, eyes clear in a way neither of his parents had been in years. Now, standing in her kitchen, Lydia could still hear the quickness of his breath when he spoke. "Dad's mad," he'd whispered, as if confession had a weight he could only hand to her. Then softer. "But I'm not. I just miss you." In that moment, the courthouse steps felt like a thin bridge between two sides of a life already split. She had crouched so her eyes were level with his. The wool of her coat brushed the stone as she bent. "One day," she told him, her voice low, "you'll have the whole story, and the choice." From her pocket she'd pulled an envelope. A plain one, no return address, nothing to draw attention. Inside was a blank birthday card, save for one line written in her neat script: "You were never the reason." He'd look down at it, then back up at her, a question on his lips that he didn't have time to ask. Mara's voice had carried across the plaza, sharper now, more insistent. Colby slipped the envelope into his backpack with the quick precision of a boy who knew what secrecy cost. Without another word he turned and jogged back toward the car. Lydia had stayed where she was, hands tucked into her coat pockets, watching until the door shut behind him. Only then had she turned away, the sidewalk stretching ahead in the thin winter light. That night, the quiet in her house felt different, less like absence and more like waiting. She set her phone on the kitchen counter, rolled her sleeves to her elbows, and powered on the small camera she used for video calls. The red light blinked. "Colby," she began, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "I don't know when you'll see this, but when you do, I want you to know who I was before anyone told you otherwise." She didn't speak in long sentences, only fragments, the truth laid out like stepping stones. She told him about her nursing years, about the house before Ethan was born, about the heirlooms and what each one meant. She told him what they'd tried to take: money, memory, her name itself. Some things, she said, you can rebuild. Some things, you just protect until the person they're meant for is ready. The heater clicked on, a low hum filling the pause between her words. Outside, the wind shifted, brushing against the windows in soft, hollow gusts. When she finished, she saved the file to a flash drive and slid it into a small cedar box, locking it with the same brass key she kept on her own keyring. She placed the box in the top drawer of her desk, under a folded quilt her grandmother had sewn. It was after midnight when she finally climbed into bed, but sleep didn't come easily. She'd almost drifted off when the chime of her laptop pulled her back. She padded to the desk, the floorboards cool under her bare feet. The glow of the screen lit the room in pale blue. The email was from the Ohio Secretary of State's Business Services Division. Notice of file: Lynn Corbin Contracting LLC. Chapter 7, Bankruptcy Petition. Her eyes stayed on Ethan's name in the header, the letters sharp against the sterile background. Bankruptcy meant liquidation. Collapse means that the business he'd bragged about for years was now as empty as his promises. She sat down, the wood of the chair cool through her robe. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't type. There was nothing to reply to, nothing to say. The news was not a surprise. It was the next predictable step in a pattern she'd already stepped out of. The wind pressed against the house again, rattling a loose gutter, sounding almost like a knock, but no one was at the door. Not yet. The bankruptcy notice still glowed on her laptop screen when Lydia picked up the phone. Ronnie answered on the first ring. Didn't Ethan take out a small business loan, with me as the guarantor? Lydia asked, her voice calm, though her fingers pressed hard against the desk's edge. He tried, Ronnie said. 6 weeks ago. You revoked the guarantee when we retitled your assets. The bank couldn't approve without you. A pause, deliberate. You're clean. Lydia leaned back, letting the chair's wood press into her spine. Then the collapse is his alone. By the next morning, the messages began. The first voicemail was almost casual, as though they'd spoken yesterday. Hey Mom, we should talk. Things have been rough. Maybe we can work something out. The second was softer, tinged with strain. I know you're mad, but you don't have to be. We can fix this. By the fifth, the edge had sharpened to desperation. They're going to take everything, Mom. If you could just help. She didn't delete them. Not yet. Instead, she downloaded each one, labeling them by date and tone, then sent the files to a transcription service. Paper proof was cleaner than audio, harder to deny. The man who'd told her she'd die alone was now asking for a lifeline. Ronnie called on Thursday to check in. You want me to send a cease and desist? Not yet. Lydia said. I want the record complete. That evening, she sat at her desk with her will open in front of her. The last amendment had been meant as a period. Now she added a condition, a quiet clause written in precise, unyielding language. If Colby contacts me willingly after his 18th birthday, the trust will expand to include the residual assets and accumulated interest. It wasn't a gift to Ethan. It was a door she left cracked for the boy who had hugged her without asking for anything in return. When she finished, she stacked the signed pages neatly, sliding them into the leather folio that held every legal document she'd touched in the last year. Then she turned to her laptop and opened the voicemail folder. She highlighted all but one recording and pressed delete. The remaining file sat alone, its time-stamp 2 years old. She clicked play. Ethan's voice, younger but already cold, filled the kitchen. You'll die alone, like you lived. She let it run until the quiet hiss at the end, then closed the laptop. The following Monday, she dressed in a dark green wool suit and walked to Ronnie's office. The air inside smelled faintly of cedar polish and coffee. A long oak table stood in the center, papers arranged in perfect stacks. 2 witnesses waited at the far end, their pens poised. Ronnie gestured to the chair at the head of the table. Ready? Lydia sat, smoothing her skirt. Ready? The ceremony was quiet but absolute. Each page was read aloud, each signature deliberate. The witnesses signed in turn, their pens whispering against the paper. When it was done, Ronnie slid the folio toward her. "This," Ronnie said, "is a living declaration. It leaves nothing open to challenge." Lydia placed her hand on the cover. "Then it's exactly what I wanted." Outside, the sky was pale and cold, the kind of winter light that made shadows stretch long across the sidewalk. She walked slowly, the weight of the folio steady in her hands. The bridge Ethan had once imagined crossing back to her was gone, burned, dismantled, replaced by a wall of signatures and seals, and she had built every brick herself. The ink on her last amendment was barely dry when Ronnie slid another stack of papers across the oak table. These were heavier, not in weight, but in what they would seal forever. "A sealed declaration," Ronnie said, her tone flat in the way a surgeon might announce a final stitch. "No posthumous challenges, no appeals, and a contact prohibition for any estate executor, Ethan and Mara included." Lydia read each line, though she already knew them by heart. The words were walls, each clause a locked gate. She signed slowly, her pen scratching across the paper like it was cutting ties that had been fraying for years. When she looked up, Ronnie was already stamping the notary seal. "3 copies," she said. "One here, one in your bank's safe deposit box, one in the county's private records archive." Lydia nodded. "Then it's done." Ronnie smiled faintly. "It's airtight, Lydia. You've closed every door." On the walk home, the air smelled faintly of wood smoke, the winter sun hanging low over Toledo's rooftops. Her boots crunched over a patch of old ice as she turned onto her street, the quiet settling in around her like a well-fitted coat. That afternoon, a knock came at her back door. Joanna from the donation center stood there, cheeks pink from the cold, a small white box in her gloved hands. "Found something in one of your earlier donations," Joanna said. "Didn't think it was meant to go." Inside, nestled on a square of velvet, was Lydia's wedding ring. The gold had been cleaned, the diamond reset in a simpler band. "It's beautiful," Lydia said softly. "Thought you might want it back," Joanna replied. Lydia held it a moment longer, then placed it back in the box. "I do, and I'll decide where it goes next." Joanna gave her a knowing look, then helped her carry a final trunk from the porch to her van. Inside were the last of the family heirlooms china that no longer matched, a rocking chair with a leg repaired one too many times, photo frames stripped of their glass. "You sure?" Joanna asked, resting her hand on the trunk's lid. "I'm sure," Lydia said. When the van pulled away, Lydia stood for a moment in the pale afternoon light, watching until it disappeared around the corner. The house behind her was lighter now, pared down to only what mattered: memory, peace, and legal walls no one could scale. Inside, she took the wedding ring from its box and placed it in a small metal tin. Alongside it she added a few photographs, a newspaper clipping from her nursing graduation, and a USB drive labeled "Only Colby." She sealed the tin in a cardboard cylinder, wrapped it in brown paper and wrote across the front, "Open when ready." It wasn't for a birthday. It wasn't for a holiday. It was for whenever Colby decided to knock on a door that would always open for him. She set the package on her desk, ready for Ronnie to send with her next courier run. The evening crept in slowly, the kind of soft winter dusk that made the edges of everything blur. Lydia made tea, the steam curling in the lamplight, and sank into her armchair. The knock at the front door was sharp, unexpected. She set her mug down and walked to the entryway. Mara stood on the porch, coat buttoned to the neck, cheeks flushed from the cold. Her expression was unreadable, but there was no smug tilt to her mouth, no sharpness in her eyes. She didn't speak. Instead, she extended her hand. In it was a plain white envelope. Lydia took it, feeling the weight of paper and whatever words it held. Mara turned and walked away without a sound. The envelope was warm from Mara's hand, though the cold had already begun to creep into the paper by the time Lydia reached her armchair. She slid it open with the edge of a letter opener, the metal glinting in the lamplight. Inside were 3 pages, The first a hurried scrawl of apology, letters leaning unevenly as though written by someone who couldn't decide whether to beg or accuse. The second was a single sheet headed debts owed, each line item circled in red ink: credit cards, utility arrears, the collapsed business loan. The last was the shortest. Help us. Lydia read them once. Then once more, slower, letting the desperation seep through the thin paper into her fingertips. She didn't answer. Instead she rose, the wooden floor cool beneath her bare feet, and walked to the fireplace. The embers glowed low, the smell of faint wood smoke curling up from the grate. She placed the pages gently on top, watching as the heat curled the edges inward. The flames licked at the handwriting, first blurring the ink, then devouring the paper entirely. The red circles turned black before vanishing into ash. Without thinking, Lydia began to hum, a soft, wordless tune she had once sung to Ethan when he was a baby and colic had kept them both awake through the long Ohio nights. The melody wound through the room, unbroken, even as the last of the paper collapsed into the fire's orange belly. When it was gone, she crossed to her desk and pulled out the worn leather notebook that had traveled with her through every chapter of this fight. The pen fit easily into her hand. I was never alone, she wrote in the last page's center. I was just surrounded by the wrong people. She set the pen down and left the notebook open, the ink still wet enough to catch the light. Then she moved to the kitchen, put the kettle on, and waited for the water to boil. The faint hiss was steady, unhurried. When the tea was poured and the steam rose into her face, Lydia sat at the table. The house was quiet, no footsteps, no raised voices, only the occasional pop from the cooling fireplace. She took a slow sip, the warmth spreading down her chest. Peace, she thought, was louder than inheritance. It didn't need to announce itself. It simply filled the space where noise had been. Her gaze drifted to the refrigerator. Colby's drawing, a crooked little house under a bright yellow sun, was still magneted in the center. The paper had curled slightly at the edges, but the colors hadn't faded. Outside, autumn leaves scudded across the lawn, swirling in small wind-tossed circles. The air smelled faintly of rain on cold earth. She let herself sit there, wrapped in the knowledge that every decision she had made was final, not just in law, but in spirit. Ethan's last attempt at the upper hand had turned into nothing but smoke in her own living room. She took another sip, set the cup down, and looked toward the window, where the light was beginning to dim. He said I'd die alone, she thought, letting the words settle in their true shape. I didn't. I lived alone, on my terms, and he'll live with nothing, by mine.